guys, welcome back to a one-room schoolhouse, and today we're talking about weapons, or maybe more specifically the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment was where the Founding Fathers pointed out that people need to be armed to defend their communities, their town, their families, their state, right? The militia is supposed to be well armed, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but there's some courts who have come out and said, well, there might be some stipulations upon what you can keep and how you use it and what weapons look like. And some people even argue, wait a second, Founding Fathers had muskets, so these new weapons should all be banned. There's a lot of talk and conversation about some of this, and there was a Ninth Circuit decision where it was ruled that people didn't have the right to have a gun out in public, to display it or maybe even carry it with them at all, which does seem to be contrary to the Founding Fathers' original intent of the Second Amendment.
Yeah, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So keep and bear. But this is where it gets interesting. What does it mean to bear arms? Now,
you just muzzle sweep that person like 8 times. I apologize. We're gonna.
Can I?
I'm gonna point this. I'm gonna point this down. We got it now. Don't worry. Good. Safe direction.
It's safe direction. So the Founding Fathers actually had discussions over how you could regulate where weapons appeared. Couldn't take them away from you, couldn't prevent, but there were regulations that said, well, when you come into town, you can't have your pistol where it's easily seen. Or they said if you come into town, you can't bring a pistol for offensive purposes. In other words, if you're going to commit a crime, you can't do that. You can bring it in for defense.
And let's clarify too, because this was different in different towns.
It was.
The Founding Fathers said this. Well, some said that.
That's right.
Some said something totally different. And this is where it's interesting studying history, is it's not always as cut and dry where it comes to something like the right of the people to keep their arms shall not be infringed. We think, well, that's so clear, except even after this was done, there were towns who had certain provisions that said you can't carry certain weapons in town. You can't shoot certain weapons in town. And it makes you have to question, well then, were they really talking about you have guns with you all the time everywhere? Because that's what part of the argument is today. And certainly the Founding Fathers' intent was that people have the ability and capacity to defend themselves.
That's right.
And they could use the modern technology of firearms to defend themselves, because part of their defense was also against a tyrannical government.
Well, part of that defense, they were allowed to have cannons. You could personally have whatever the top technology was and armament back then, the individual could have that as well. Now, they did have regulations on where you could shoot your cannons, but you could have a cannon. So the right to keep and bear arms, you could have the same the government had, because the government might become your enemy someday. That's what had been with the British. So they didn't say, well, whatever the government's got, you've got to have the level below that. That wasn't their thinking at all, is since you are the militia, and since the government may call you into service on a militia level, on a military level, you got to be armed. So they didn't think that way. But it is interesting that in the larger towns like Boston, the regulations really over where you displayed arms and used them was much different than a state like Georgia that was much more rural.
In the midst of this too, it's important to remember that the Bill of Rights was written as a restriction on the federal government. So states had the ability to pass certain laws that was different than the federal government, whereas in the First Amendment it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. You can go through the rest of the First Amendment. The restriction was on the federal government, but part of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, says that whatever is not explicitly given to the federal government belongs to the states. What that means is states do have the legal authority to pass certain restrictions, and if we don't like those restrictions, then we need to elect new leaders in those states to get better policies that better represent and reflect the right of the people to be able to defend themselves, their homes, their families. But sometimes we get confused in the Second Amendment community about the federal government and state governments. And the Founding Fathers did believe states have authority and states can pass laws. And if you don't like it, you need to get different representatives, right? Get people that represent you better. But this is where, even as we hear conflict today about the Second Amendment, sometimes the conflict is really more about the federal government versus the states. And the states do have a lot of authority, which is the way the Founding Fathers intended it. They wanted to restrict the federal government and allow the state governments to still be strong.